Hello and welcome. My name is LJ Stambuk. I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. Today we have the privilege of having with us former Secretary of Defense Dr. William J. Perry and Plowshares Fund Policy Director Tom Collina. They wrote a book called The Button. It is about the new nuclear arms race and presidential power from Truman to Trump. And as you see in the side there, former President Bill Clinton says every citizen should read this book. Former Secretary Perry and Plowshares Director Tom Collina have been making the rounds of the national councils around the country, and this is such an important topic. We're delighted to have you here today at the World Affairs Council Charlotte's Distinguished Speaker panel. Thank you for being here, Secretary Perry, and thank you for being here, Tom Collina. Our program partner today is World Affairs Council of Orange County. Great to have you partnering with us today. Thank you for being here, and all the people that are members of the World Affairs Council of Orange County. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and we will continue partnering in the future. For those of you that are not knowledgeable about the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, we are the Charlotte's community premier global education nonprofit, and we are nonpartisan. A little bit of technical and technological issues here. Your microphone will be on mute and your camera turned off for the duration of the presentation. However, we will have a question and answer part of this program today. Please see the toolbar that we have highlighted below to submit your question at any time. Please use the question and answer box circled in red so we can get your questions. This presentation will be recorded and will be sent out via email to the World Affairs Council and Orange County mailing list, so please make sure you're signed up to receive our emails. Finally, if you enjoy today's free program, please do consider making a financial gift to help support our work at these difficult times for all nonprofits and the country. Our website is www.worldaffairscharlotte.org/giving. We appreciate it and thank you so very much. So Dr. William J. Perry is the Michael and Barbara Berberian Professor Emeritus at Stanford University. He is a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute and the Hoover Institution and serves as director of the Preventative Defense Project. He is an expert in U.S. foreign policy, national security, and arms control. Secretary Perry was the 19th Secretary of Defense for the United States, serving from February 1994 to January 1997. He previously served as Deputy Secretary of Defense and as Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. Dr. Perry currently serves on the Defense Policy Board, DPB, and he is on the board of directors of Covent and several emerging high-tech companies. He is a member of the National Academy of Engineering and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. From 1946 to 1947, Perry was enlisted in the Army Corps of Engineers and served in the Army of Occupation in Japan. He joined the Reserve Officer Training Corps in 1948 and was a second lieutenant in the Army Reserves from 1950 to 1955. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1997 and the Knight Commander of the British Empire in 1998. Perry has received a number of other awards and has received decorations from the governments of Albania, Bahrain, France, Germany, Hungary, Japan, Korea, Poland, Slovenia, and Ukraine. He received a BS and MS from Stanford University and a PhD from Pennsylvania State University, all in mathematics. Very impressive. As Director of Policy, Tom Collina brings 25 years of Washington, D.C. experience in nuclear weapons, missile defense, and non-proliferation issues to Plowshares Fund. He has worked extensively as a researcher, analyst, and advocate to strengthen the efforts to end U.S. nuclear testing, rationalize anti-missile programs, extend the non-proliferation treaty, and secure Senate ratification of the New START Treaty. Prior to joining Plowshares Fund in 2014, Tom served as research director of the Arms Control Association. He was the executive director and co-founder of the Institute for Science and International Security and the director of the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, among other leadership positions. He has published widely in major magazines and journals and has appeared frequently in the national media, including the New York Times, CNN, and NPR. He has testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and regularly briefs congressional staff. Tom has a degree in international relations from Cornell University. And Tom, I am also a Cornell Big Red grad. So welcome to Secretary Perry, and to Tom, it is a real pleasure to have you here. We will have Lisa Perry moderate the conversation, and Lisa Perry is the Digital Communication Director for the William J. Perry Project. Inspired by the work of her grandfather, Bill Perry, Lisa has taken on the charge to translate nuclear issues for her post-Cold War generation. Building on her 5 years working with Dr. Perry on educating the public on these issues, this summer she has released her own project, At the Brink, a podcast exploring the untold stories of nuclear dangers. Highlighting the personal accounts of Bill Perry's long career working on the nuclear threat, the podcast also features a wide range of voices from congressmen, physicists, former missileers, A-bomb survivors, and including a former president. Finally, as we just mentioned, if you enjoy this free program, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to help support our international education mission. Membership is a crucial contribution to the leading community platform for nonpartisan discourse on the most important international topics. So if you're not, please do become a World Affairs Council Charlotte member. Thank you very much to all the participants for being here today, and let's start with the conversation. Please go ahead, Secretary Tom.
Thank you very much. Hello, Charlotte. It's great to be here. I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me for a second, and I hope this works. Okay, there we go. Again, thank you for having us. It's a pleasure. I'm Tom Collina, Director of Policy at the Plowshares Fund, and I had the honor of writing this book, The Button, with former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, which was published just recently in June. We published it at this time to mark the 75th anniversaries that are currently happening. Of course, in July, we had the 75th anniversary of the first nuclear test. And this month, in fact, today, marks the 75th anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing, and this weekend will be the Nagasaki bombing. And of course, this November, we will choose our next president. Every 4 years, we get to do that, and the president has authority over nuclear policy like no one else. And so to us, these events create an opportunity to debate the future of US nuclear policy. We have lived with the bomb for 75 years, and what should the next president do to reduce the risk of nuclear war? First, some context. As we all know, the current national crisis is dominating our current discourse. The battered economy, the resurging coronavirus, racial injustice, all of these things create important opportunities for change. For example, the coronavirus shows that US leaders have been focused on the wrong threats. We are spending way too much time on outdated Cold War scenarios and not enough on the real threats we face today. And after despite spending $740 billion on defense each year, many Americans simply don't feel safe. Take, for example, the $1 trillion that the United States plans to spend on nuclear weapons over the next few decades. Much of this is simply not needed, and we should see this as a nuclear piggy bank that the next president can break open to pay for higher priority needs. But this is not just about money. We need to change policy too. The bomb does not address the most serious threats we face, and in fact, it can make those threats even worse. So let's unpack this a bit. We like to show this photo because it tends to focus the mind. Here is President Trump with the infamous football. the briefcase that contains everything the president needs to start nuclear war. This is literally how close we are to nuclear war every day, every minute, right now. The president can order an attack on his own authority with no second opinions. Input from Congress or the Secretary of Defense is not required. Now, we don't mean to single out President Trump in this way. His impulsiveness and disregard for expert opinion highlight these concerns, but all presidents make mistakes. They're all human. And that's why we feel strongly that no single human should control the future of humanity. Yet we, the American people, choose to give presidents this absolute power. Why? Why do we choose to live so close to the nuclear brink? Well, we think it's because US policy is focused on the wrong threat. So let's get into the core aspects of the book. So in the book, we make this central argument. First, that US policy is focused on the wrong threat of a surprise attack from Russia. Such an attack is highly unlikely for the simple reason that it would mean the utter destruction of both sides. And yet US policy has been focused on this threat for decades. But the big problem here is that this mistaken threat assessment increases the risk of blundering into nuclear war by mistake. We could start a nuclear war in response to a false alarm, one of the greatest dangers in the world, and we simply don't need to take this risk. Instead, we must move away from quick launch policies and give the president more decision time. So, Bill, turning to you, you had a front row seat to the arms race and met with Soviet and Russian officials many times. Some might challenge our central assertion that a surprise attack from Russia is not a likely threat. What would you say to them?
When I was the secretary, I met with dozens of Russian leaders from the president on down. And since then, I met with hundreds and perhaps thousands of Russians. I can say with great confidence, the Russians are not stupid and they're not suicidal. And therefore, as you said, we're focused on the wrong threat. A disarming surprise attack on the United States is really not realistic. What is realistic, though, is we could blunder into a nuclear war.
Thank you. So this perceived threat of a surprise attack drives the military requirement that the United States must be ready to launch nuclear weapons at all times within minutes. This in turn drives three dangerous policies. First, that the president, as we mentioned, has sole authority to launch nuclear weapons within minutes with no second opinions or oversight. That the president can order a first strike and is not limited to retaliation. And this is something most Americans simply don't realize. And third, that the president can launch hundreds of land-based ballistic missiles, ICBMs, on warning of attack without waiting for proof of attack. In the book, we go through all the arguments as to why this is dangerous. But Bill, if you could please give us your sense of why this combination of policies is so dangerous to the country right now.
I think the most striking issue on which we find a danger is the possibility of a false alarm. False alarms triggering the president to actually make accidentally start a nuclear war. It's not a theoretical possibility in my mind. We have had three of them that I'm aware of historically. Two of them occurred during the Cold War when I was the Undersecretary of Defense. One of them is particularly in my mind. I was in my bed, sleeping soundly, 3 o'clock in the morning when the telephone rang, and the voice on the other end of the line identified himself as the watch officer at the North American Air Defense Command. The first thing he said to me was that his computers were showing 200 ICBMs on the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. What a moment. Happily, he quickly added, he had concluded his computers were somehow in error. And he was calling me to see if I could help him figure out what had gone wrong with his computers. It took us actually 2 days to discover that I couldn't do it over the phone. turned out to be nothing more than a simple chip, a microchip in one of his computers had gone faulty, machine error. On an earlier false alarm, it happened to be a human error. When they changed shift that evening, the new operator, thinking he was putting the operating tape in the computer, mistakenly put in a training tape, and so the computer was showing a very realistic attack underway. Well, machines do err still today. Humans still err today. And so we could have this problem again. So I'm very much, nobody can ever tell me that a false alarm is a theoretical problem. To me, it's very real.
Thank you. Let's expand on the dangers of sole authority. In 1963, President Kennedy warned that we could stumble into nuclear war due to accident or miscalculation or madness. Bill, can you explain how this might happen?
First of all, a president can get bad information, and President Kennedy is the poster child of that. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was getting information, which he was missing vital information about the deployment of nuclear weapons in Cuba, and on that basis could have made a very wrong decision. We also have the potential problem of an unstable decider. Our picture here shows President Trump as an example of that, but we're not picking on President Trump. There have been several instances in history where we can be concerned about that. President Nixon, for example, was heavily drinking the last few months in office. And President Reagan was in the early stages of Alzheimer's in his last few months of office. We should not put so much dependence on one person, one fallible person. The false alarm, as bad as that problem has been in the past, it's aggravated today with the advent of cyber, where a rogue nation or a rogue group could somehow interfere with the command and control system to our warning system. So we have all of these factors which could lead us to blunder into a nuclear war.
Thank you. So let's move to solutions. What can we do? The next US president, we feel, must reorient nuclear policy away from a surprise Russian attack to preventing accidental war. Please, Bill, lay out the main arguments for how to do this.
The first is to end the sole authority. There already is pending in Congress a bill by Markey and Liu to do that. It will have no chance of passing this year. It could be passed next year, or a new president next year might himself take the initiative to end sole authority. Secondly, the new administration could establish a no first use policy, saying that nuclear weapons are here for one and only one purpose, namely to deter a nuclear attack on the United States or its allies. We will not use them first. Again, there's legislation pending in the Congress today by Senator Warren and Congressman Smith for that purpose. It has no chance again of being passed, but in the next year, maybe we have an opportunity. We can get behind that new legislation. And then finally, we should phase out our ICBMs. They're the reasons we have the possibility of a false alarm leading to an accidental launch. In a sense, our ICBMs are accidents waiting to happen. Instead, we should base our deterrence forces on our submarine forces and on our bomber forces. Tom?
Thank you. So in wrapping up, so we leave time for plenty of questions. Nuclear weapons are the president's weapons, and every 4 years we have a chance to change US nuclear policy. And the 75th anniversary of the bomb and the current national crisis should inspire us to rethink our approach to national security. US nuclear policy is doing more harm than good. It magnifies the dangers we face from the most likely nuclear threat, which is blundering into nuclear war by mistake. So the next president can and must fix this. We know this will be hard. We're up against 75 years of outdated thinking and a $50 billion industry. History tells us that major change like this is only possible if led by the president with public pressure to deliver. So we are looking to educate the next president and the public like you. Thank you very much. And if you are interested in buying the book, please go to benbellabooks.com and use the button 30 code for 30% off. And if you like the book, please rate us on Amazon. Thank you very much, and we look forward to your questions. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much. We also have the book available at Park Road Bookstore and other bookstores in the area. And as we said, it is something that should and be read by everyone in our country and in our city. Lisa, please go ahead. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
And good to see everyone. To start off with, your book highlights the fact that the president has sole authority to order the use of nuclear weapons. But historically, what was the logic behind creating such a policy? And why does that logic not work today?
Well, I'll start with the history piece, because this was actually fascinating to me, which I didn't realize as we went into writing the book. I had assumed that the reason we had presidential sole authority was so that the president could launch nuclear weapons quickly in response to a surprise attack from Russia. But of course, if you think about it, President Truman was the one that declared sole authority in 1945. And in 1945, no one else had nuclear weapons other than the United States. So there was no possibility of a surprise nuclear attack. What happened with President Truman is that when he saw the devastation of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki 75 years ago, he was so distraught and taken aback by that he determined that no other bomb would be dropped unless he personally authorized it. So that was the source of sole authority, where the president said only civilians will decide this. But unfortunately, he made it only one civilian, himself. He didn't share that authority with Congress, the other civilian authority. So in the book, we recommend that the president should share the authority for first use with Congress to delay that decision, to make that decision more democratic, and to make the use of nuclear weapons less likely.
If the decision to launch nuclear weapons was, as you say, brought into more hands, whether it be Congress or just a select group of people, would that somehow reduce our ability to respond quickly to an enemy attack? And would that hurt our deterrence posture?
Yes, it would certainly not allow us to make a quick response, a 5-minute response. We think that's a good thing about it. We do not want to make a quick launch. Whether or not we have that policy, we do not want a quick launch, because a quick launch is what makes it possible to have an accidental launch, an accidental nuclear war. We do not believe that a quick decision is necessary. Our submarines at sea can carry out our deterrent forces, even if our ground forces are destroyed. So we think the deterrence is in place in any case. And we think that the quick launch is very dangerous. And so we do not want a quick launch. So whether or not anything else happens, we want to do away with our quick launch policies.
And just to emphasize, for two reasons why we want to get rid of sole authority. One is we don't think the Russians will launch a surprise attack out of the blue, and therefore there is not a need to respond so quickly. The other is that imagine that an attack were incoming, very unlikely possibility. But even if it were, a president being able to quickly launch US nuclear weapons in retaliation would not stop the incoming attack. The incoming attack would land anyway. So what we would like to see instead is the president should wait and see, because if it is a false alarm, as have happened before, and the president launches before he knows whether it's real or not, he could have started nuclear war by mistake, which to us is the ultimate nightmare.
And can you speak to whether any other countries have a sole authority policy, or whether other nuclear nations have declared a no first use policy? And regardless of what their policies are, should that have any effect on whether we should adopt those policies?
Well, China has a no first use policy, and we think it isn't just words, that it's actually backed up by their nuclear posture, which separates their warheads from their missiles. And we think the United States should move towards a no first use policy, as China does. In terms of use policy, it appears that Russia has a very similar sole authority position than we do. In other words, the president of Russia, President Putin, can single-handedly order the use of nuclear weapons from Russia. And that's very dangerous for us, because if Russia blunders into a nuclear attack, launches by mistake, those weapons are probably coming over here. So we need to work with Russia to reduce the chances of accidental war, and hopefully to add more decision makers into their launch process.
In your book, you claim that we're headed into a new nuclear arms race. You make a strong case for why this is a dangerous path to be headed down, but how can we, as the United States, get off of this course if right now Russia and China are already working to expand their nuclear arsenals?
Well, the key is to make our nuclear forces capable of upholding a strong deterrence for the United States. And that measure is true whatever the Chinese have or whatever the Russians have. So there's been a tendency in US policy over the decades to determine our nuclear forces to be equivalent to those of first the Soviet Union and now Russia. Keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. But the real test for our nuclear forces should be, are they capable of upholding our deterrence? And that's not really measured by whether they're equal in size to the Russians. It's measured by their ability to withstand an attack and still reply. Tom, do you want to add to that?
Just to say that, look, I think we learned during the first Cold War and the first arms race that nobody wins. We built tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. We spent trillions of dollars. We came to the brink of nuclear war, and only by luck did we escape catastrophe. So let's learn from that. Let's not do it again. And as Secretary Perry says, we only need enough nuclear weapons to deter attack by others. We don't need to keep up with other countries. We don't need to race with other countries. We're just wasting our resources and increasing danger to ourselves and the world.
I would add one other thing to that. During the Cold War, when we did believe that the measure of a force was being equal to or greater than that of the Soviet Union, it was also true that the Soviet Union had that same view. And that dynamics, that you always want to be a little equal to, a little bit better than the other guy, that dynamics led to an incredible nuclear arms race. It led to 75,000 nuclear weapons in the world. That's an incredible result. And my students will often ask me, why do we need 75,000 nuclear weapons for deterrence? And the answer is probably we don't. We could deter with perhaps 100, few hundred nuclear weapons. But 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, all of that can be explained only on the basis of this arms race dynamics. We're about to enter that same kind of a nuclear arms race dynamics today, with Russia making and bragging about their buildup of nuclear weapons in the United States following course. I thought the first nuclear arms race was a terrible waste of resources and dangerous. I never dreamed that we want to live in a second nuclear arms race, but that's what we're in the process of doing now.
The book explores the history of 7 decades of US presidential nuclear authority. Today, nuclear weapons and non-proliferation treaties have seemed to become partisan issues. Has it always been that way?
Not at all. In fact, efforts to prevent nuclear war used to be bipartisan, even nonpartisan. And if you go back and look at the most successful treaties, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the START treaties, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, they all enjoyed bipartisan support. So it is really unfortunate that now the treaties that were started by Republicans, for example, the START treaty process began under President Reagan and President Bush. now to see that process ending under President Trump. And so these treaties really are in the security interests of the United States and the world. They deserve bipartisan support. But unfortunately, because the public perceives the Cold War to be over, the arms race to be over, and the nuclear danger to have receded, public concern about nuclear weapons has dropped. So we see politicians being able to maneuver on nuclear policy sort of under the radar without the notice of the public. And that's a problem. And so part of our efforts here is to get the public re-engaged in the nuclear policy debate so that there's more public pressure and more public opinion coming to bear on what our leaders in Washington do.
Lisa, let me turn the tables and ask a question of you. You've just finished a new podcast called At the Brink. It was launched a month or so ago. What can you tell us about why you did that, who it's addressed to, and what's the stage of the launch?
The podcast, well, it was inspired by you, but in general, the podcast came out of my own experiences as a millennial, as someone who grew up in a post-Cold War era, and recognizing that despite what was taught in history class, most of my peers think that nuclear weapons are an issue of the past. And through the work that I've done with the William J. Perry Project and how much I've learned that that is very much not the case. And in fact, as you have often said, that the danger is greater today than even during the Cold War. And what we try to do with the podcast is try to explain to everyday people who may not be interested in these issues why they should care, particularly going in and explaining the hidden stories about nuclear dangers, the stories you may not have learned about in history class, to demonstrate that not only were these issues bigger than we thought in history, they are continuing to be an issue today. And I will close our Q&A with one final question for you both, which is that today is the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. Each year, survivors gather on this day to call for the elimination of nuclear weapons. Do you think that eliminating nuclear weapons is a possible future that we could reach? And what are some steps that we could take to try and work towards global zero?
A little over 10 years ago, I joined George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, and Sam Nunn in a series of op-eds and talks and speeches calling for the abolishment of nuclear weapons. So I believed it then, and I believe it now. After 5 or 6 or 7 years of very hard working on that problem, we finally became convinced it was not going to happen anytime in the near future. But rather than give up completely on this, I've shifted my attention to what we can do to greatly reduce the dangers of the nuclear weapons we have. That's what the book, The Button, is all about. How do you reduce the dangers of nuclear weapons? Tom?
In the book, we lay out our top recommendations for what the next president should do to reduce the nuclear dangers. And those top 3 are to eliminate the sole authority that the president has to launch nuclear weapons, to reduce the danger of blundering into nuclear war. The other is to declare a no first use policy, so the United States cannot start nuclear war, but only defend itself from others attacking us if necessary. And third, that we should phase out our land-based ballistic missiles because they are tremendously expensive at the cost of about $100 billion, but they're very dangerous because they increase the risk of the false alarm danger because the president would be under pressure to launch those weapons before a possible incoming attack arrived. So it's important for all those reasons to give the president more decision time to reduce the chances of blundering into nuclear war.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Really appreciate your participation. Thank you, Secretary Perry. Thank you, Tom. And let me just share with you that we did have Tom Collina interviewed on Charlotte Talks on Monday, August 3rd, about the button. And it was Mike Collins, our good friend. He's a great interviewer, and we have received great reviews of that. So you could click on the link here that Noah Maris, my colleague, has put down for all the panelists and attendees, and you can listen to that interview, 1-hour interview. Again, as we said, you can buy the book in many places. Tom mentioned one, we mentioned Park Road Books. I would like to add Amazon.com, and if you do use Amazon.com, please use the Smile Amazon link to support the World Affairs Council. It is a very small amount, but it does accumulate, and it's a great way for you not having to spend a penny extra, but at the same time supporting the World Affairs Council of Charlotte and the World Affairs Council of Orange County for those of you calling in from the West Coast. So a number of you I can see have questions in the chat box, and I will not call out your names, but if you do want to get your question read and participated in this conversation, please try to put it into the question and answer part so that we can actually get your question out. So can we start with the question and answer part? Wayne Cooper, during Watergate, did the Joint Chief of Staff tell the military not to accept orders from President Nixon to launch missiles? Who will take this one on?
I'll take that on. It wasn't the Joint Chiefs of Staff, it was the Secretary of Defense, Jim Schlesinger. And I believe he did do that. But there's no way of knowing whether the military would in fact accept that order. It was an illegal order, but he tried anyway.
Thank you so much. That's an interesting piece of historical trivia, very important, but it's good that we cleared it out. Joni Rice recently had a pleasure to hear a John Mitchum podcast where Mr. Mitchum disclosed that Mr. Oppenheimer had regrets and second thoughts about his role in the development of the nuclear bomb. My question to you is, do you think President Truman had regrets as well?
Well, he certainly moved after the bomb was first dropped to seek international control of the bomb and to eliminate atomic energy use in a weapon. He did not succeed in that, as we know, unfortunately. But one thing he did succeed in doing is taking the bomb out of military hands and putting it only in civilian. And that has turned out to be quite a lasting legacy. Since Truman did that, the nuclear bomb has never been used again after 75 years. So certainly, I think Truman felt very strongly that the bomb should be used minimally, if not at all. And it turned out that the steps he took have meant that the bomb has never been used again.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. Anonymous attendee, how does second strike capability work and decisions made, especially if U.S. leadership is completely gone? And I can repeat the question if I need to, so just give me a signal if you would like me to read it again. Yes? Okay, how does second strike capability work and how are decisions made, especially if U.S. leadership is completely gone? Anyone? Tom?
Sure. I mean, I think the idea, first of all, the idea is that deterrence is based on the ability to retaliate to any attack. So that is why we support the elimination of the land-based ballistic missiles, because even if we don't have those weapons, we have our weapons on submarines and on bombers if they're able to get aloft in a crisis. So what deterrence depends on is that any adversary like Russia knows that if they attack the United States, they could not avoid a massive retaliation that would end Russian society as we know it. So that is deterrence in a nutshell. How it would work, luckily we've never had to be in a situation of nuclear war where the president had to make decisions of that kind. There is a chain of command where if the president were to perish in a nuclear attack, the authority would move down the chain to the next decision maker. So I think Russia is reassured or has confidence that they would not be able to, as it said, decapitate the United States with a nuclear attack. The United States would be able to respond. And the last thing I would say here is that even if all decision makers have been killed in a nuclear attack, our submarines are still out there. Our submarine commanders are still out there. And Russia could have no confidence that those commanders would not choose to launch their weapons.
Thank you. So we have a question from William McNamara, who's saying the following: during the writing of the book or for any other research, were the reports that were created by the two teams that were sent to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in September 1945, assessed for some of the details on impact contained in those reports? I understand the reports were focused on physical damage, not human impact, and were classified immediately after World War II. But the 50-year limit has long passed. Are these reports now part of the public record? Are these reports now part of the public record? Secretary Perry.
I don't know the answer to that question, but a recent book has been written. I'm trying to come up with the name of the book right now on mine, that deals in great detail with the issues being answered. The question, I would refer that book to the person who was asked the question. And if I come up with the name and the author of the book, I will email that to you after the program.
I think it's called Fallout, I think.
Fallout, that's the book, right? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Stephen Shore is asking, however unlikely a first strike by any foreign power might be, given a legitimate belief that one was occurring, how could others be involved in the American response without delaying it? You need to repeat it, or go ahead.
No, I mean, again, well, first of all, we think it's tremendously unlikely that any other country is going to launch a first strike at the United States, because it would be suicidal for that country. There's no reason to expect that the United States would not be able to retaliate to a first strike. So we simply don't think it's likely. Second, if an attack were incoming, it wouldn't do any good to respond quickly, because that incoming attack, as unlikely as it is, would still land. So from our perspective, and this is one of the basic premises of the book, is that we don't need to respond quickly. There is no need for the President of the United States to respond within minutes to an alert, to an alarm of an attack. And in fact, that would be the worst thing to do, because you would probably be responding to a false alarm, in which case the president would be launching nuclear war by mistake. So we think that we should do everything in our power to avoid that catastrophe by not moving quickly to launch.
To be clear, in our proposal, you would delay the response, and we think that's desirable. We think that's a virtue, not a liability. We want to delay the response for due consideration. There's no reason to rush into a nuclear war.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Secretary Perry. Bill Brandon says, in the contemporary world, land grabs by regional powers often have local superiority. Examples are Crimea, possibly Taiwan. So the US has found it increasingly difficult to fight local wars on the borders of hostile regional powers. What strategic threat would replace the threat of first-use retaliation in deterring such regional powers?
Well, just to say that first, the threat of first use is not needed for deterrence. Let me just put that out there. Deterrence, as we said, is about second strike retaliation. We do not need to use the threat of first strike for deterrence. And in fact, I would say the threat of first use is a very poor deterrent, because it's not credible. The United States would never start nuclear war, particularly not against a nuclear adversary, because it would be suicidal for us. So this is one of the reasons why we say the United States should declare a no first use policy, because we don't need it for deterrence, and it will help us avoid accidental war.
Thank you. Joe Klein, do you find American foreign policy regarding nuclear armament to be hypocritical? such as permitting Israel and India nuclear arms but condemning others. Which country should be permitted to have nuclear arms? Is any regulation of international armaments realistically achievable? So 2 questions, I guess. Are we hypocritical, and is there any regulation of international armaments realistically achievable? And third question, who should be permitted to have nuclear weapons?
Well, I think we would both agree that no one should have nuclear weapons, that we support the ultimate elimination of nuclear weapons in a balanced and universal way. And yes, to the extent that the United States is, guarding its arsenal of 6,000 nuclear weapons while at the same time telling others not to have them, I think that is hypocritical, and it's certainly going to undermine U.S. efforts to succeed. So I think U.S. policy would be more successful if, while urging other countries not to get nuclear weapons, which I don't think they should, it hasn't done us any good, the United States should also be working towards reductions and towards the elimination of nuclear weapons.
Let me add to that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the basis for stopping proliferation in the world, has 2 features to it. One is the non-nuclear powers agreeing not to build nuclear weapons, but the other is the nuclear powers, including the United States, agreeing to work seriously towards the reduction of the nuclear arsenals. If that were happening, then this problem of hypocrisy is more or less dealt with, but it's not happening, and therefore it's a complete hypocrisy, and it does not fool anybody.
Thank you very much. Quantad Online has a comment. She says 75,000 nuclear weapons. Eisenhower was right about his warning of the military-industrial complex. Dollars and power wasted instead of providing the citizenry the means for health development by education, healthcare, also national infrastructure of necessary systems, health development progress. So this is a comment which you can comment on if you desire or not. But let me move to the next question, and maybe you can combine your answer. Chris Lancashire says, it is all well and good to have rules in place for the US, but how do we control some of the rogue states like North Korea and Iran?
Well, just to comment on the previous question, I think the question is exactly right. To the extent we're spending money on nuclear weapons that we don't need, we're not spending it on other things. And so particularly today, when we see the economy in such a crisis, needing to spend more money to address the coronavirus, or more money to address climate change or racial injustice, that money has to come from somewhere. And if we don't want to just keep piling on more debt, we need to cut our government spending. Pentagon spending, and particular nuclear spending, is a great place to start. And now, of course, I've forgotten your next question, so I'll ask you to repeat it.
The next question is, let me find it. Is it all well and good to have rules in place for the US, but how do we control some of the rogue states like North Korea and Iran?
Well, I think we have to talk to them. I actually support President Trump's effort to engage with North Korea diplomatically to restrain their program. Unfortunately, he didn't have a viable plan. His plan was just asking the North to give up their nuclear weapons up front, and that wasn't going to work. But we have to engage diplomatically. It was very unfortunate that President Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, because that deal was working to diplomatically, through inspections, to limit Iran's nuclear program. So we need to get back to engagement, get back to diplomacy, and that's the best way to work with other countries and reduce nuclear threats abroad.
More generally, we have to lead by example, and we're not. We're leading in the wrong direction by our example.
Okay, thank you for that. So Isabel Fangman, she's a student. I wanted to ask that although the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty is under the sole jurisdiction of the United Nations, do you believe NATO has a role in the creation of a planet without nuclear weapons? And if so, what should they be responsible for? What should NATO be responsible for? Even more specifically, will this responsibility be disrupted by the threats of our current president to withdraw from NATO?
Well, I don't know if Bill and I have talked about this. I don't actually know his thoughts here. But my personal view is that, of course, the United States deploys nuclear weapons in NATO. We have about 150 nuclear weapons in Europe. I don't see any security rationale for those weapons. I think it's more of a political statement that we make to support NATO. And so if we can find some other way to show our support for NATO, which I think the United States should support NATO, it shouldn't be a nuclear support. So I would support withdrawing nuclear weapons, US nuclear weapons from NATO. And I think NATO should support that for its own security. These weapons are not necessary for their security, and there should be other ways for the United States to support NATO security.
An interesting question, again from Stephen Shore, if I may. Assuming that the president's sole authority to launch nuclear weapons was replaced by the majority or unanimous approval of, say, a council of 5, wouldn't the president's calling a meeting of this council be the equivalent of announcing a decision to use nuclear weapons? Should I repeat the question, or?
No, I think the answer is not necessarily. That council of 5 could be, for example, be formed to deal on many other issues as well. And this could be one of the issues they're dealing with. So convening it would not necessarily signal that.
Thank you. Rosemary Schmidt, we assume that security clearances in the US preclude rogue actions. Is that true in other nations with nuclear capabilities? In other words, do other countries have similar systems to prevent someone doing something that no one would want to see happening?
Well, I would just say that the only check we have to not having a president use nuclear weapons in a way that we don't support is our election process, right? Only the elections stand between a rogue president and nuclear war. And I would have to say that check is not working. We've had numerous presidents now, Trump being just one of them, who has indicated behavior that is not consistent with, not suitable for the sole authority to launch nuclear weapons. So I think we need an additional protocol. We need an additional check on that. And to me, that's either sharing that authority with Congress or declaring a no first use policy.
So I guess the question, just if I may clarify it, is what do other countries have as a way to preclude other countries' rogue actors doing something that no one wants to see? In other words, we have security clearances. What do other nations have as a way of preventing someone getting access to nuclear launch capabilities that were not intended by the government of that country? Do you know?
Well, I mean, certainly Russia. In Russia's case, it's a very similar system where the president has sole authority to launch Russian nuclear weapons. If you go further down, I think your question is, if you go further down the chain of command, how do we make sure that people are in the system do not go rogue? And part of that is background checks, security clearances. But part of it is that no one person is allowed to make that decision on their own. For example, missile control launch officers. It takes 2, at least, to agree that a launch should go underway. And that reduces the chances that any one of them can go rogue and make a catastrophic mistake. But it's interesting, we don't apply that to the president, to the commander in chief. Again, in our system, the president and the president alone can decide to use nuclear weapons. There's no second opinion required.
Okay, I'll move to the next question. I believe we have time for 2 more questions. This is an anonymous attendee saying, the current administration has spoken of nuclear weapons as a part of America's options for responding to a wider range of nuclear and non-nuclear threats and actions of adversaries. These examples seem to be far outside the deterrence and defense agenda relative to Russia and today's discussion. Are we seeing nuclear weapons creeping into the traditional strategic weapons portfolio relative to regional conflicts, i.e. Trumpian demonstration of military power or hyperbole?
A short answer is yes. My own view is that nuclear weapons are used for a single purpose, and that is for the deterrence of nuclear use against the United States or its allies. We're drifting away from that, and I think that's a tragic mistake. Tom?
Yeah, and I would add that it just encourages other countries to get nuclear weapons. So for example, if we're going to start threatening the use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states, then the response of those states is going to be, well, then we need to get our own nuclear weapons too. And to the extent that we're threatening the use of nuclear weapons against nuclear armed states, I would say that's simply not credible, because no president is going to launch an attack that means the utter destruction of US society and civilization. So I think the less we threaten the use of nuclear weapons, the better, and the more that we narrow the potential use of nuclear weapons, the better, which is why we suggest the sole purpose distinction, that the only purpose of US nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear attack against the United States or our allies.
Thank you. Now, this is a question for Secretary Perry. Can you speak to us about the China nuclear threat now and in the future? And second part, Saudi Arabia, there are some reports that Saudis are working on obtaining a nuclear bomb. Is that true? Is that happening? Can you comment on both of these, please?
Historically, China has had a very limited nuclear force, relatively small by our terms, a few hundred instead of a few thousand. And most importantly, it's been deployed in a way that it cannot be used quickly. And that's all to the good. My concern is that there seems to be some evidence not yet confirmed that China may be changing its policies. It may be increasing the number of nuclear weapons it has. It may be reviewing its policies. So the history of China has been reassuring, but the present is a matter for some concern.
Saudi Arabia, nuclear bomb?
I'm inclined to believe that they would like to have one. I think it would be a tragic mistake for them to get one. We should do everything we can to keep that from happening.
Thank you very much. And I think this is going to be the last or next to last question. The New START treaty is set to expire in February 2021. What practical advice would you give to people who want to change US nuclear policy and prevent or stop a possible nuclear arms race?
Well, to stop a new arms race, which we think is a real danger, job number one is to extend the New START treaty. And so President Trump could do that right now, because the Russians have said they're willing to do that. It wouldn't take a vote of Congress. It just takes the agreement of the two presidents. But so far, President Trump has been unwilling to extend New START. And so if that situation remains, then it'll be up to the next president, which if that is President Biden, he has said that he would, as president, move to extend the New START treaty. So that is the first thing to do. And so save arms control, essentially, by extending New START. The other thing we need to do is get out of this tit-for-tat building of new nuclear systems that we don't need. Both the United States and Russia are building too many nuclear weapons, spending too much money on nuclear weapons. For example, the US program to spend $100 billion to build a new generation of land-based ballistic missiles. We don't need them. We should save that money for other things. And by doing that, we would send a strong signal to Russia that we're not into an arms race.
Thank you very much. I'll have one more question. Secretary Perry, do you have a comment on the START treaty renewal?
A comment on what?
On the START treaty renewal in February 2021, what would be your advice to those that are working on the renewal of the treaty if it happens?
We should just renew it as it is, use that as a basis then for considering various extensions of the treaty as was originally planned. New START was conceived in the first place as a first step in a series of arms control treaties. So first of all, we simply extend the New START. And then secondly, we begin the discussions with the Russians on how to extend it by making further reductions.
Thank you. Well, we'll have one more kind of encompassing question, if you allow me to extend our meeting just a little bit over our allotted time. For something as important that puts all of civilization at stake so quickly and with so few actors needed, why do you think that the nuclear topic is not at the forefront of the media and most American minds?
That's a wonderful question, and it needs a psychologist, which I am not. But fundamentally, the American people, and I think the Russian people as well, tend to believe that with the end of the Cold War, that the nuclear dangers are gone away, and they just don't think about it anymore. During the Cold War, for whatever else we had going for it, we at least knew what the problem was, and we're very concerned with it. Today, we have the same problem, if not a greater problem, but the people don't understand it and aren't concerned about it. Our job, and really a particular goal of our book, to reawaken the public knowledge and this interest in this question by informing them of what the real issues are. Tom, what do you want to add to that?
No, just to say that the dangers are real. Unfortunately, the public attention isn't focused on it. And so if we don't ask our leaders to address this problem, our leaders will not address this problem. So it's up to us to bring some public pressure on our leaders to act.
Thank you so very much. We're so glad you joined us this afternoon for this conversation. We had Secretary of Defense, former Secretary of Defense William Perry, and we have with us Tom Collina, Director of Policy at Plowshares Fund. They're co-authors of The Button, the New Nuclear Arms Race in Presidential Power from Truman to Trump. We highly recommend to all our participants here today to read this book, get it first, and then read it. We would like to thank our partners, the World Affairs Council of Orange County. Thank you, everyone, to all the participants participating here. I would like to especially thank the board members of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte who are participating. Thank you for your leadership. Again, Secretary Perry, Tom Collina, Lisa Perry, thank you. It was a very, very interesting, insightful conversation today, and we thoroughly enjoyed it and obviously learned a lot. Thank you so very much. We're adjourned. Have a wonderful rest of this afternoon. Take
Thanks
care.
for having us.
Our pleasure. Thank you. Thank you both.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.